Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the show. I am your host, Mike Malatesta. On this podcast, I dig in deep with every guest to get to the roots of their success, to discover not just how it happened, but why it matters. My mission is to expose the ideas and clues you need to inspire, activate, and maximize the greatness in you. Today I'm talking to Professor Katherine Sanderson about what it's like and why it's important to be happy and why it's so darn hard. Positive psychology coming up. Please enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome back to the How Did It Happen podcast. I'm so happy to have you here as I am with every episode. And my podcast is powered by Winject Studio. And today I have an amazing success story to share with you. I've got Dr. Katherine Sanderson on the podcast. Katherine, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for this invitation to talk. I'm so looking forward to it.
So Katherine and I met a couple of weeks ago in Milwaukee at a YPO event at Cristo Rey, which is a charter school. Amazing, from what I could see, amazing charter school. And she gave a presentation there that I was blown away by on the psychology of, and maybe the science too, of happiness. And it was really, you're in for a treat because well, first of all, you're an excellent presenter, by the way. Let's just get that out of the way here. And I was fascinated by her because we had the chance to sit at the same table for dinner. And I was like, all I was thinking about was how much preparation time have you put into this, and how all these sort of nerdy questions behind the scenes. At least that's what was going through my mind. So she was very gracious in answering those questions as well. So let me tell you about Katherine. So Katherine Sanderson is the Polar Family Professor and Chair of Psychology at Amherst College. She received a bachelor's degree in psychology with specialization in health and development from Stanford University, which, by the way, that young man at the event was also going to Stanford, as I recall.
Yeah, wasn't that a nice little segue? Yeah, that was and I'm so jealous of him that he gets a chance to start anew. I would love to be heading out there for my first year.
And you didn't plan that, so he wasn't selected to match up with you or anything.
No.
Okay,
Wasn't that wild? Yeah,
it was wild. Yeah. So this kid from very modest means in the city of Milwaukee headed to Stanford. That was nice. So anyway, and then she went from Stanford to another school you might have heard of for her master's and doctoral degrees, which both she earned from Princeton University. Her research has received grant funding from the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Health. She's published over 25 journal articles and book chapters, in addition to 4 college textbooks, middle school and high school health textbooks, as well as the Introduction to Psychology course for the Great Courses. What is the Great Courses?
So the Great Courses is a lecture series. So it includes videos of professors that you can stream or you can buy. And it's really designed to introduce people to a variety of different topics that maybe, you wish you'd taken a class in astronomy or ancient Rome or psychology in high school and you didn't have a chance to do so. So now it's a big series that runs and just includes, thousands of classes, mini classes that people can watch, online or, in video, et cetera.
Okay. All right. Well, I got to check that out. The Great Courses. You should check it out as well. Thank you, Kat. In 2012, she was named one of the country's top 300 professors by the Princeton Review. That sounds prestigious. So thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
She's written She's written a ton, as you can see. Her books. She's got a bunch of books. The Positive Shift is one of her books, and then her latest trade book. And I'm sorry to just keep tromping all over your introduction, but what is a trade book? I've never heard that before.
Oh yeah. That's kind of like an industry lingo thing. It basically means a book you could buy at Barnes and Noble. So a book designed for a general audience, as opposed to a textbook, designed for students, or a scholarly book designed for other professors in my field. So a trade book is, a book that you could pick up at an airport, or, designed again for a general audience.
Okay. So it distinguishes it from a purely academic book. Is that?
Or
fair?
A textbook,
or a textbook.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So that sort of, if you think about books, I could write books, for undergraduate students to use in my classes. I could write books for other people with PhDs in psychology. And a trade book is sort of designed for the general audience. So anyone should be able to pick it up off the shelf and, be able to read it, listen to it, et cetera.
Okay. Okay. So her latest trade book, published in North America with one title, which is Why We Act, Turning Bystanders Into Moral Rebels. And that's from the Harvard University Press. And internationally, the book is called The Bystander Effect, The Psychology of Courage and Inaction. And that's published by HarperCollins. I'm going to get into this a little bit because you can tell I'm already, this whole trade book, textbook, and then these different names. So I'm going to get into that a little bit later. That book examines why good people so often stay silent or do nothing in the face of wrongdoing. If you want a preview of the topics addressed in that book, you can watch Katherine's TEDx talk on the psychology of inaction, which describes the factors that contribute to inaction and provides strategies we can all use to help people act, even when those around them are not. Katherine regularly speaks for public and corporate audiences, and you can find out more about that at her website, which is Sanderson, Sanderson, speaking.com. Her talks have been everywhere for good reason, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this, including, she's been featured in the Washington Post, Boston Globe, USA Today, The Atlantic, CNN, CBS Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley, and on and on. We also have a commonality. As her, if I remember correctly, your daughter is headed to Dickinson College in the fall of 2022, and that just happens to be my alma mater as well as my wife's alma mater. So go Dickinson.
Yeah. Red Devils? Is it Red Devils?
I think it is. Yeah, Red Devils. Yeah. At least that's what that's what I call it. If maybe it's changed. It's been a little while since I've been there, but. Yeah, so Katherine, the podcast, I started every one of my shows with the same simple question, and that is, how did it happen for you?
So my story of how did I get to where I am really started during my undergraduate time at Stanford. And so I started Stanford with a strong interest in medicine, and in particular with children. So I began volunteering in the pediatric hospital at Stanford Medical Center. And, I really had a goal of becoming a pediatrician. And then I began pre-med studies at Stanford in chemistry, and it became clear that that was not really my forte. And it was going to be a long, frustrating road that may well not have ended up with acceptance to medical school. So let's say that dream, very quickly shifted. And I then fell into psychology, and, psychology is, related in many ways to the idea of helping people. And I thought I would become a child clinical psychologist. So I, began studying psychology with, again, this desire to, help people in a very direct way. And as part of that work, I volunteered for a campus hotline dealing with people who were experiencing, thoughts of suicide and, depression and other issues. And what became very clear to me was that I was not going to have the ability to really separate myself from people dealing with very severe problems, that I would leave my volunteer shift and I would go home and I would ruminate and I would be obsessed about it. And I just felt, sad. And I came to the realization pretty early, probably my junior year, that I was not going to be able to be a clinical psychologist and have a happy life, because it was going to really just sort of take me over. There are people who can sort of separate, and that was not my ability. So that led me to explore other parts of psychology. And my senior year, I did a thesis with a wonderful professor, Anne Fernald at Stanford. And the thesis was really researching, how do babies learn to talk? So that was our topic. And what I found that year was that I loved research. I loved the idea of coming up with a question and figuring out a way to answer it, and then figuring out if I was right. And it kind of felt to me like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle. And I absolutely loved it. And I realized that was really where my passion fell. And then I also realized at the end of that year that I didn't care at all about how babies learn to talk. Babies do learn to talk. They all learn whatever. And that was not the question that was going to drive, a 50-year career. And so that led me to sort of shift from developmental psychology to social psychology, which is what I do now. And by and large, because what I really love, and I think what was clear in the talk that you heard me give and in my writing, again, of trade books, is what I love is psychology that matters in real and fundamental ways in people's lives. And what I think I'm pretty good at and really enjoy is taking complex research findings in the field of social psychology that people can use and implement in their own lives, whether that's how to be happier, how to be healthier, or how to stand up to problematic behavior, that all of those are sort of the research questions that really intrigue me. And that's pretty much what I do now. I teach and write and talk about psychology that matters.
And so thanks. That's an interesting journey. I'm curious. I want to kind of hone in on this clinical work that you did as a volunteer early on. Probably a good thing for you that you did it so early, because it showed you that maybe that wasn't the right path for you, right? But I guess I'm wondering, trying to put myself in your shoes as a 19 or 20-year-old person, being on the phone with people who are experiencing serious challenges in their life. How long did you do it for? And I mean, you sort of mentioned how it dissuaded you from doing it long term, but how did you help? How were you able to help people when you were? How did you do it? That's, if you can remember.
Right. No. So it was a program that was run by the Counseling Center at Stanford, and it was really designed to be not therapy, right? It was not therapy, but it was really designed to help people access support that would help them get actual treatment. So sometimes it was people just calling and saying, I feel sad, I feel lonely, I feel depressed, or, et cetera. So part of it was being a listening ear. Part of it was telling people, you're not alone. And then part of it was also saying, here are resources that you can access. So that could be low cost therapy. It could be free therapy. It could be, you should go to the emergency room, that here is that, here is, this is a 911, call, et cetera. So we received training. And again, I imagine training has probably evolved in the last, 30 years, or whatever, but we received training, and it was ran by, an entirely volunteer staff. And it was really designed to try to have people have access to a listening ear and some direction in that sense. But what I found for me was that there were other people who were volunteers who could kind of do the volunteer work, who could, talk to people for a period of time and sort of cheer them up or direct them appropriately. And then they could kind of walk out and, go get pizza and be fine.
Okay. So yeah.
And I was not, like, I couldn't do it. And I think that's something that for people who get degrees in clinical psychology, which is not my degree, but for people who get degrees in clinical psychology, I think there's actual training and focus on helping people do this sort of disconnect. But I think there are people who are better at that sort of naturally than others. And I'm still not naturally good at doing that. I mean, I'm someone who still, when I have students who are facing difficulties, I check in with them with a fair amount of regularity, that I'm somebody who continues to think about, things and people that I've talked to or that I've taught, et cetera. And so I do think there are probably individual differences in people who can, disconnect and compartmentalize and lead sort of happy and productive lives. And I just felt I would be, a mom sitting at the dinner table, unable to focus on, what was going on in my personal life because I would be so swept up in these people who are really struggling.
Right. It almost sounds like the difference is the person who can do it and do that for a living is sort of like at the end of the session or at the end of the call, they're like, well, we made good progress today. And you, and probably me too, because I think I'd be the same way. We're like, we didn't fix it today.
100%.
Right?
No, 100%. And I imagine I have a cousin who is a doctor who works in emergency rooms, and he likes the excitement of you never know what's going to walk in the door, and you do. And I just can't imagine having that ability to see somebody, and somebody's family, maybe facing, the worst days of their life, and to be able to leave and go spend time with his family or whatever. So I do imagine there are people who are good at that. And then I think there are probably people like us who just are not. And frankly, kind of figuring out where you are early on. I mean, I feel lucky that I decided to do, I think one of my professors actually said, well, a good way to get some experience is to do X. And I was like, okay, sign me up. And then I learned, boy, but that was really useful because as you can kind of tell from my story of how I got, here, a lot of my story was finding out things that I wasn't good at. Chemistry was one, hotline work with severely depressed people was another that was not good. So, and frankly, part of it was figuring out what I was good at, what I liked, and what I wasn't good at. It was not a sort of linear progression to this is what I want to be doing. And I knew that 30 years ago.
Writing my book, Ownership, was one of the most challenging and rewarding experiences of my life. I did my best to share my stories and lay it all out there. And the response has been awesome. If you're looking for inspiration to help you create an amazing future for yourself, pick up a copy of the book, Ownership, How Getting Selfish Got Me Unstuck, on Amazon, and leave a review. Well, and maybe we can talk about this from a psychology standpoint, but when you said that, it sort of made me think about the sort of proliferance now of people espousing that you need to find your passion and follow it. And on the one hand, every time I hear that, I'm like, okay, yeah, that would be great. On the other hand, finding your passion seems to me to be the byproduct of exploration. And if you wait to know and find your passion before you do any exploration, I feel like it has the opposite effect. Like telling me that I need to find my passion actually keeps me stuck in not exploring. What's the psychology on that?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And it's one that I think about a lot, frankly, as a professor, but also as a mom. I have, a son in college, a daughter, as we've mentioned, heading off to college, another son who graduated from college a year ago this weekend. And, I think a lot that I have students who come into my office, their first day of their first year, and they're like, so just to let you know, I'm going to double major in philosophy and biology, and that's going to prepare me for my MD, PhD, so whatever, I have it lined up. And there's some students who come in with that sort of direction and they're very successful. But more often than not, I see students who arrive in college who have a direction and then find sometimes accidentally, I took this anthropology class and all of a sudden I found I love this, or, I thought I was going to be pre-med, but I took this history class and I can't imagine not majoring in history. And I really try to encourage my students to open themselves up, because when you arrive at college, there's so many different things that you actually can't know anything about, because in high school, you can't take a class, for most students, can't take a class in psychology or geology or, political science. I mean, students take, math and English and Spanish and their biology, but there's so much that they don't have exposure to. So right. I do think that a lot of things are accidental. A lot of things are random in some way. I mean, as you said in my lovely bio, I have, the opportunity to have written a number of textbooks. I've written some trade books. Almost all of those came out, sort of accidentally. Somebody approached me and said, would you like to do this? And I was like, maybe, I don't know, maybe I would. And sort of exploring and figuring out, what you do like. And sometimes that is saying yes, right? Saying yes. And then figuring out, well, did that work out or did that not? But really sort of opening yourself up to different opportunities, I think helps you figure out what you love and what you're good at.
So that saying yes thing is marvelous advice, because I wrote in my trade book, I wrote that was part of a chapter for me. It was like when I first got my job out of college, which was with a waste management company, which when I was growing up was not my dream, but as I evolved, it seemed like a good opportunity. But then the thing that really, I think, made it my profession was every time I was offered an opportunity to do something, I just said yes. I didn't ask how much it paid. I didn't ask, why are you picking me? I just figured if I say yes, I'm going to get to explore something new, and that'll either make me think this is the way to go, or make me think, maybe there's a different way to go. But if I didn't try, I would that say yes thing, I think, is very powerful.
Mm-hmm. There's I was actually on a podcast a couple of years ago, and I'm completely blanking on the name, but it's something like Getting to Yes or Just Say Yes or something, but it's actually ran out of Second City in Chicago. And there's a wonderful podcast host, Kelly Leonard, who had actually taught me during that interview that one of the, I guess, hallmarks or secrets of improvisational theater is you always say yes. Like you always just go with it, because otherwise it stops the scene, right? If you're like,
right. Yeah,
I don't have a response to that. And so you just keep going with it. And the idea, I think, is so clever, because it really is just kind of being open to things, that happen to you at random. And there's so many times in my life in which I can think about things that, I kind of didn't want to say yes to, and I did. And I'll give just one, tiny example is that about, I don't know, maybe 8 or so years ago, I was asked by one of my students if I would be the faculty advisor for a cancer support group on campus. And my mother died of cancer. So I think that sort of is, part of why they asked me, but it was a group of students whose lives have been touched in some way by cancer. Some of these were kids who were themselves in remission, from cancer. Some of them were kids who had lost a parent or had a parent or sibling in hospice care. So I really did not want to say yes, because I was like kind of going along with the story that I shared at the start here. Like, is it going to be hard for me emotionally? Is it going to be something that I have, difficulty separating from? Is it going to be a weird sort of combination of my role as a professor, and sort of at a distant, advisor, academic versus sitting with these kids in my living room. But the kid asked me, and the kid had lost his mom to cancer, and, my heart went out to him. And so anyway, so I said yes. And the kids, pre-COVID, the kids met in my living room once a month, and they met in my living room because some of them cried, and they didn't want to do that, on campus in a lounge or a public setting. They wanted to sort of have the distance. And I will say that I got to know so many of these kids, in such a meaningful way. And it's really, they're kids who I literally heard from one of them yesterday, who wanted a letter of recommendation, a student who graduated 3 or 4 years ago. Another one, I hear from with some regularity. I reach out to the kids pretty often on like Mother's Day or Father's Day. I'll send an email, to the group. And the relationships that I form with those kids have just been super meaningful and continue to be so. And it's just an example of something that I did not want to say yes to. I sort of, I frankly tried to find another faculty member who would agree.
Oh, you did?
I did. I actually reached out to a colleague and was like, maybe you'd like to do this. And she was like, not really. And then I was like, okay, but I think now that it's just an example of something that I tried to not say yes to. But I'm so glad that I did say yes to, and it's been super meaningful, to me, and I think to the kids.
And I think, if my memory is right on our conversation, even you mentioned the books and stuff coming from saying yes, but I think your speaking and presentation came kind of that way too. And we talked about Sean Aker, and so tell us about that. Yeah.
So there's a group called One Day University. If somebody Googles it, I think it's like onedayu.com. And they're a group that pre-pandemic used to do would bring in a series of professors, somebody in psychology and somebody in music and somebody in history or whatever. And they would, give talks. So general, 1 hour talks. And these were held, across the country. So I've done it in Milwaukee, I've done it in Chicago and New York City and, San Francisco and DC and, really all over. And before the pandemic, I was doing it, at least once a month, sometimes more. And it was always, a lot of fun talking to, big audiences. And I talked about different topics in psychology. I talked about the mind-body connection and health and persuasion, et cetera. And, and it was fine. It was, going well. And then the organizer of One Day University, who now has become a dear friend, called me one day and said, listen, one of our most popular talks is The Science of Happiness by this really great person, affiliated with Harvard University, Sean Aker. And he's just been awesome. And in fact, he's been so awesome. Sorry about that. He's been so awesome that he now has a whole career in which he speaks, full time to, Disney and Nike and, places across the country, such that, he's not really going to go and do these little, podunk One Day University talks because, he's now making a giant amount of money, working for corporations. And he goes, so any chance you could pull together a talk on the science of happiness? And I was like, sure. I mean, science of happiness is all about psychology. Like that's easy. So I worked on, crafting a talk. I had never taught about the science of happiness. It's not a, class I teach at Amherst. But I was like, sure, I know psychology. I can read the literature or whatever. So I created a talk on the science of happiness. And that now, that's the talk you heard. That talk has been, featured in the Boston Globe. It's been featured in the Atlantic. It led to an interview on, CBS Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley. And it led to a book that I published in January of 2019, The Positive Shift. All of those things came from Sean Aker getting too famous and too wealthy to talk, and somebody saying, "Hey, Katherine, could you do this?" And it's been tremendously rewarding. I love, talking about the science of happiness. And one of the reasons that I love it is that I regularly hear from people, who've heard the talk and have said something like, "Listen, I was feeling kind of like this, and your talk, inspired me that now I can, do something different." Or, I have never been a super happy person, and I've started this gratitude journal, and it's really helped. So I love the idea, of reaching out and helping. And I will say in particular, in the early days of the pandemic, so, about 2 years ago now, I was not doing well. I mean, I was really pretty freaked out, and I would sit in bed at night and sort of Google, what is the rates of COVID transmission in my community, and how many ventilators are there left, and what are the signs of COVID? And I was really freaking out. And I started to get these emails from absolute strangers. Emails, I got a postcard in the physical mail, I got a letter in the physical mail, and people would say, the strangers, I remember hearing you talk about the science of happiness, 3 years ago in Dallas, or I picked up your book and every day I flip to a random page and I read it, and it's always helpful. And I just want you to know that during this pandemic, your book or your messages have been so helpful. And I would think to myself, I should read that book. That sounds really useful because I'm not doing well. But again, that's just an example of how I love the idea that, people who I don't know, have found something that I've said or written that has been useful to them in some way. And one of the key findings in the field of positive psychology is that happiness is contagious. So, me talking about happiness, you allowing me to talk about happiness actually spreads and creates more happiness in the world, which is good for all of us.
So there was a ton of interesting stuff that you said in there. I just want to pick up.
Sorry, it was a long answer.
No, that was good. The first thing you said was that you never taught, and you don't teach from the science of happiness. So that I don't know if I knew that when I talked to you before, if we covered that. I found that very interesting because it makes me think, well, first of all, what do you teach? And then second of all, you should be teaching the science of happiness that they will allow you. So what are some of the things what are some of the classes you are teaching?
Yeah. So what I will say is that, first of all, I love teaching. I mean, that was, probably obvious to you in hearing me talk. I love teaching. And And I love teaching pretty much everything. But in the field of psychology, positive psychology is kind of new, and positive psychology is kind of integrated into lots of other things that I teach. So I could, in fact, teach a class on positive psychology. I hope that none of my students are listening to this, because I'm asked by my students all the time, would you teach a class on positive psychology? And basically the challenge is, in order to teach that class, I would have to give up teaching something else. So it's a little bit like, which class could I drop? So I teach Introduction to Psychology, which is, the big overview of the discipline, which a lot of people don't like to teach because it's the big overview of the discipline. But I love teaching intro psychology because it's basically like teaching the greatest hits, right? Like a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and I get to talk about everything. So I love that class. I teach social psychology, which is really about, how do we relate to the world? What do we get persuaded by, and how do we fall in love, and what leads us to behave altruistically or aggressively, and how do we change our minds? And all of those topics are fascinating. And they're particularly fascinating in these days of political polarization in society and COVID norms and, sort of all of these things that are changing all the time. So I love that class. I teach a class in sports psychology. A lot of students at Amherst are athletes, current athletes or high school athletes. And so I teach about sports psychology, and I love that class. I just finished teaching a class on close relationships. So this is a seminar for seniors, and we talk about love and jealousy and conflict and attraction. And I love teaching about that, because here's one of the keys to the field of positive psychology. Single best predictor of your happiness: quality relationships, right? Mm-hmm. That's it. So although I don't teach a class, and I could teach a class on positive psychology, I teach about so much of positive psychology. Another class I teach is health psychology, and the link between happiness and health is clear. In fact, my book, The Positive Shift, the full title is The Positive Shift: Mastering Mindset to Improve Happiness, Health, and Longevity. So although the field of health psychology isn't the same as the field of positive psychology, it absolutely is interrelated, because what we know is that people who have a positive outlook and good relationships and spend time in nature and focus on gratitude, all of those things increase happiness. They also all increase health and longevity. Mm. And so much of my teaching actually feels like it takes little pieces of positive psychology and just interweaves them into the whole discipline.
Okay, fair enough. And I do, that makes sense to me. One of the other things that you were talking about was this sort of early in COVID, how you were Googling and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering, and you said, you get the postcards and stuff, and people are saying about stuff in your book, and you're thinking to yourself, man, I should read my own book here. But as you were saying that, I'm thinking about leadership books, and I'm thinking about your type of books and all these different type of books where people are experts and they're, imparting their wisdom and experience on it. But it's not always easy to do what you say.
No, I mean, it's not. And, one of the key findings is that, I know the literature well. And when I am mindful of the literature, I am good about practicing it. But it honestly, for me, and I mean, this is one of the points, of course, I made in the talk that I gave to you, and actually, is the opening story of my book, that one of the keys is that, I am not someone who's naturally happy, that I, have a family history of depression and, bipolar disorder, including, close genetic relatives, who've suffered from both of those. And so genetically, I am not pre-wired to be a happy person. And I've spent a lot of my life, feeling sad or anxious, or sad and anxious. And so for me, I think one of the challenges of the pandemic, for me, early on, was all of the things that I knew that made me happy, I couldn't do, so I didn't initially find it rewarding to teach online in Zoom, just sitting there. I feed off my students. And so to sit there, early on to a bunch of people without their cameras on, like this was not easy for me. I had a bunch of speaking engagements, talking about the science of happiness. I had a book tour. All of those got canceled. One of my key things that I love doing pre-pandemic, this is a little bit of a sort of embarrassing tidbit, but pre-pandemic, I taught aerobics. Like I taught as in a gym for money aerobics. And I loved that. That was my exercise. And of course, the gym shut down. There was no aerobics. There was no gym. And so sort of this way that I had been exercising for, 20 years was all of a sudden gone because that was my exercise. And so sort of all of these things that I had used to feel greater happiness were just gone. And so I think for me, it was actually really hard. Now, I will say on a more uplifting note, I really started saying, okay, I'm going to have to develop new skills and strategies, in this strange new world. And I spent a chunk of time doing that. And that was in fact really rewarding. And I think in lots of ways, I am probably happier now than I was before the pandemic, in lots of distinct ways. But for me, it was really a process of sort of saying, here are all of these strategies and tools that I've used that I know work for me to find happiness. And then all of a sudden they're gone. And so what do I do? And it was certainly a process for me.
Huh. Yeah, that was very interesting for you to go through that because, the things that bring you happiness, relationships, you don't have relationships. Health, you don't have health or the same kind of health. Smile, you're not having these relationships, so you're not smiling with people. You're wearing a mask, no one can see you, right?
Right.
So even the best of us.
Right,
even the best of us, right? Even the ones who know all the science, still, it's hard.
It was really hard, and I think that it was also the kind of thing where one of the key findings in the literature on positive psychology is that control matters, and I think for me, I am kind of a high need for control person. You might well be as well. And so one of the challenges of the pandemic was all of a sudden control was gone, right? You couldn't control when am I going to go back to my office? When are my kids going to go back to college or in high school? When am I going to be able to get on a plane again? When are things going to open up? When can I eat in a restaurant? All of these things. And so the uncertainty was really, really challenging, for me. And I think for a lot of people. And that I think was one of the hardest things about the pandemic was this lack of certainty about, when are things going to get back to normal? When will we be okay? And, that again, still in a sense seems like an open question.
How does your high need for control manifest itself?
Yeah, so I would say it manifests itself in lots of ways. I would say that, I spend a lot of time thinking about the future. In the field of psychology, we call that cognitive labor. So I spend a lot of time thinking about, what is the future going to hold? So my daughter is starting college, as we've talked about, before getting on this podcast with you today. I helped her think about what freshman seminars should she take and what are potential college majors she could, pursue. And I literally spent time sort of going through and looking at different majors and being like, okay, there could be this, there could be this, there could be this. So that's an example. I am always planning a vacation. I am always planning, okay, what are we going to do, at Christmas? What are we going to do in December? And those are all examples of sort of ways in which I am trying to exercise control over my life. I have I'm just going to pull, I have literally a syllabus here. This is a syllabus for a class that I'm teaching starting in September. This, of course, is the end of May. I do not need to have my syllabus done this week for a class that will start in September. But part of this is thinking, okay, what is my fall like? What is my fall like? What am I doing? And that is about need for control. How does this sort of structure through? What are the assignments? And so I think in a sense, it probably leads me to be, organized and efficient, but it means that I really am sort of thinking about, multiple different things in my personal and professional life, really at every moment.
Okay. And interestingly, you're not thinking about the future in the way that a lot of people think about the future, which is with worry and uncertainty. Yours, it seems like your focus on the future is about eliminating both of those things and maybe more.
100%. And it's also, I will say that, the future planning for me is very much about what can I control? So there are things that I can't control, right? I can't control a lot of different things. But this is what I can control. So Amherst has, from the beginning of the pandemic, professors have had to wear masks when they teach. students, I mean, even, last week or 2 weeks ago when my classes ended, I was wearing a mask. My students were all wearing a mask, and not just wearing a mask, wearing an N95 mask. Everybody's wearing an N95 mask, although everybody is vaccinated and boosted and tested once a week. But you know what? I can't control that. I can't control college rules about masks. I can't control college rules about, distancing. I can't control any of that. But you know what I can control? I can control my assignments and what the students are going to read and, when they're going to take their tests and whatever. And so I'm pretty big at focusing on, what is within my control.
Okay. Thanks for bringing that up, because we talked about that at dinner as well. Was this probably one of the last institutions that was still requiring that in May of 2022? What do you so I'm going to try to link this future thing with the psychology of having gone through multiple years of being told you have to do this, which, wearing a mask or something, and not just at Amherst, but anywhere. What do you feel like the psychological consequences are going to be particularly on the younger people who haven't had the years of being like, this is bull, I don't want to do this. They're like, this is what this is what they say, whoever they are, this is what they say. And I wonder how that will inform their future when it comes to their, what do you think?
Yeah. So there's actually fascinating research in psychology that has looked at the differences between what psychologists, I'm going to get a little bit nerdy here, so I'm just going to apologize ahead of time, has looked at the differences between cultures that are what we call tight versus loose. And basically they're cultures in which there is a lot of sort of adherence to social norms. This is what we do. This is, we trust the government, we follow orders, et cetera. And then cultures that are much looser.
Hey everybody, if you like my content and want to hear more from me, go to my website, www.mikemalatesta.com right now and sign up for my newsletter. It'll come to your inbox every Thursday with stories that will help you inspire, activate, and maximize your greatness.
In terms of there's not a consistent, this is what we do, this is how we obey, et cetera. And what's really interesting is that cultures vary, this is of course data pre-pandemic, cultures vary tremendously on how much they adhere to sort of tight social norms versus there's much more sort of individual freedom and flexibility. And one of the key demonstrations within that in terms of COVID is that in many of the Asian countries, Japan, China, Korea, et cetera, people were wearing masks before the pandemic. And wearing a mask is just kind of, what you did, you saw it. And they're continuing to wear masks now. And what you see in the United States is there are real differences across cultures within the United States. So again, in certain parts of the country, mask wearing continues to be pretty normal. And in other parts of the country, mask wearing tends to be virtually non-existent. And so what I find most interesting is when I'm teaching students who are coming from all over, students who are coming from China, who are like, of course I'm wearing a mask and I'm going to continue wearing a mask. And then I have students who are coming from, let's say, Texas, in which they haven't worn a mask for a year and a half. And it's really weird to be on campus wearing a mask. And so what's interesting about colleges across the country is it's kind of a melting pot, right, of students coming from across the country, across the world, in which there are very different traditions and norms about mask wearing. This semester in Intro Psych, I simultaneously had students emailing me saying, could you please remind other students of the importance of wearing the N95 mask fully over their nose, in class? I've noticed some slippage. And then I had other students coming to office hours being like, I'm not wearing a mask in office hours. That's good, right? And my rule in office hours, for the record, that we were allowed to control what happened in our offices. My rule in office hours was, I will do whatever the student does. So if a student wants to wear a mask, I wear a mask. If a student doesn't want to wear a mask, I don't wear a mask. That I felt like my office should be a place where they are comfortable. And if they're more comfortable wearing a mask, I will wear a mask. If they're more comfortable not wearing a mask, I won't wear a mask. But I'm going to defer to their preferences to create a sort of feeling of inclusivity, what is best for them. But to me, that's really the most interesting piece, is sort of understanding that different people come from different backgrounds and experiences. And I think it'll be fascinating to see how that sort of shapes up and changes in the weeks and months and years ahead.
Yeah, so I don't have a global view. So this is probably an ignorant view, but like when the first time I went to the airport after the mask mandate was removed, you had 100% compliance generally at airports prior, 100%, and on airplanes. And then as soon as that was removed, I would say, and you've been in airports, so what was my experience was maybe 10% of people were wearing.
Yeah.
So that got
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that said to me something really interesting about the psychology, what people actually believe, because when the government says you have to wear it, well, like you said, you're out of, especially if there are consequences, you have to wear it. In China, for example, there are very severe consequences if you don't wear it. But as soon as they say you don't have to wear it, then it's a choice again, right? So a person, I suppose, there's a psychological decision being made there, right? What?
Yeah, I'm laughing because here's what's hysterical to me as you're saying this, and literally I hadn't put this together until your question just now. So I have flown twice in May. Once I flew to Milwaukee and I gave a talk, for your group. And I flew again last week to Cleveland. I gave a talk on the science of resilience for a group in Cleveland. So my campus has a rule that I have to be tested once a week. And if I get COVID, I actually can't go to my office. Like my ID gets deactivated. And so I am highly motivated to not get COVID because it really interrupts my life. I have to get tested once a week. And if I test positive, I can't go to my office. And that is, certainly interruptive. So I very dutifully wear my mask on an airplane. I wear my mask in the airport. I wear my mask on the airplane. And I did that going to Milwaukee. I did that going to Cleveland. So here's what's funny. Both of those talks were talks over a meal. So in Milwaukee, it was a dinner. In Cleveland, it was a lunch. And of course, I don't wear a mask when I'm talking. I don't wear a mask when I'm eating. And so I sat at both of those events without a mask on, in enclosed room with a lot of people not wearing a mask. So I gave my talk in Cleveland on Wednesday. I put my mask on, flew home, wore it for a very long time in the airport, change of planes, et cetera. On Friday morning, I got an email saying that the person who sat next to me at lunch in Cleveland just tested positive. Oh. So I was like, whoa, I was so dutiful in the airport. I was so dutiful on the airplane, but she tested positive and I sat with her for 2 hours at a luncheon. She tested positive 48 hours after, so today when we're recording this, I'm technically still in the sort of, I guess I'm on day 5 or day 6 or something. And it just strikes me as, I feel like I've been so dutiful. But I had dinner plans for a graduation party on Saturday night with friends. And I emailed them and said, yes. And they are both doctors, the people who are holding the graduation party. And I said, hey, I sat next to somebody for 2 hours at lunch on Wednesday, today she tested positive Friday. And they both said, there are unvaccinated 1-year-old and 3-year-old kids coming to this party. Please don't come. And, and so again, I think one of the challenges is that even those of us who are trying to be safe, it's just very, very hard to predict, right? And I felt like I was being super safe, and now I might be patient 0. So there we go.
And interestingly, the exposure occurred at a time when you've always been sort of okay not to wear a mask when you're eating, and
100%. And it was not, there were probably 50 people in the room. It was not, 200 people. It was not a concert or a movie theater. Yeah. And it was eating a meal. Yeah.
So let's get into the science a little bit, if you don't mind. So you said a little bit earlier that you're probably not naturally the most happy person, and your first slide is you ask us, are we a kitten and rainbow people, right? I think that's the first slide.
Yeah.
And you asked that, and I raised my hand. My wife like hit me because I was thinking, yeah, I'm pretty much like that, and she's like, no, you're not like that. So, and it sounds like you're not like that, and probably a lot of people aren't like that. Even people who in public come across that way, maybe because they feel like they have to, because it's hard to be a kitten and rainbow person all the time.
I mean, what's interesting is so you raised your hand for not a kittens and rainbow person. Is that right? Or
no? I raised my hand that I was. Yes.
And your wife called you out, was like, you are not.
Yes.
So I'm going to say she's probably right. But
probably right. Yeah.
But what I will say is that I think for those of us who are not, which seems like the two of us, it's impossible to imagine, that it could be so easy to go through life. But I will say there are people who I think do find it very easy. I remember, maybe about 5 years ago, I gave a talk on science of happiness. We get to the Q&A, and a woman raises her hand, and, I call on her, and she goes, I don't really have a question. She goes, I really just want to tell you a story. And she said, as I was driving to this talk tonight, I got stuck in a horrible traffic jam. And, it was just this, super, long traffic jam, and no one was moving. And I just sat in the car, and I just remember thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that I have the opportunity to just sit here in peace and look at the sunset. And, I'm just so glad for this moment. And I said to her, listen, anyone who can sit in a traffic jam and marvel at the natural sunset they're seeing, you had no reason to come to this talk today. Like, you are good. Like, you did not, you just should have driven home. Like, you did not need to come, because again, that was such an example. I tell a story in my book, The Positive Shift, about someone who in a traffic jam, a friend of a friend who whenever he's in a traffic jam, thinks to himself, oh my gosh, I'm so lucky that I'm not in the car accident that probably caused this car traffic accident. And that's like a remarkable ability of doing this kind of thing, because most of us, when we're in traffic, feel frustrated and, we're going to be late, and this is a waste of time. And, this is awful. And, my whole day is slipping away. And so again, I think there are people who can just sort of naturally put that, happy perspective on. I gave a story in my talk, and I describe it in my book, of my son, being excited about, his F+, which was
everything,
higher than. And so I do think there are people. And when I do that question, in different audiences, I do find that it's about a third of people, 25%, 33% of people, something like that, do say, yeah, I just always find, the silver lining. I'm pretty much always happy. So again, there do seem to be people who are probably genetically predisposed to be like that. So I think that is true. But again, let me cling to the key thing, which is that if you're not, there are still strategies you can use to get happier. So if you're not, just don't, hang up the towel or whatever, right?
Yeah. And I think I may have, in my mind, I was, as you were helping, explain that, I might have been thinking optimist as opposed to happiness. Like, I'm optimistic almost all of the time, but I'm not always happy about my optimism, I guess.
And I also think that what's interesting and frankly is interesting, particularly during, what has been a difficult 2 years, in terms of COVID, but also really has, of course, been a tragic 2 year, a couple of weeks in terms of mass shootings that we've seen. In both, Buffalo and in Texas. There are also people who are resilient, and resilient is different than the kittens and rainbows, because there are people who are resilient, which means when bad things happen, they seem to be able to take those events in stride and continue on in ways that other people just don't. And I'm always struck by the research on this, in that it, you hear stories about, well, I mean, frankly, the example that you gave earlier of the young man who is heading to Stanford in the fall, who clearly, has probably experienced some adversity, is growing up in a low income family, hence he's attending, that particular high school. And he is probably somebody who is naturally resilient, who has been able to take adversity and get himself into this school and excel in this school, even when he doesn't have the sort of financial resources or other sort of advantages that other kids might have. And he probably is like sort of the epitome of one of those cases of people who are genetically predisposed to be resilient in the face of difficulty. And they're people who seem to have some kind of a genetic constellation that allows them to do that. And they're people who do not.
Right. For some reason, my mind flashed to like defense attorneys who, defend people who have done really horrible things. You really have to be able to detach yourself from your mission or your assignment and the circumstances around why you are having that, right?
100%. Right. No, and it's interesting because you and I have talked earlier in this interview about my cousin who works in the ER, and we've talked about like my inability to sort of separate in terms of clinical psychology. And that's probably a similar thing, right? If you're a defense attorney and you're representing the person who, shot up the Parkland High School or whatever, being able to say, my responsibility is for this person, right now, and to separate out that probably, in some sense, those may be common personality traits, right? That ability.
Yeah. Yeah. So we know that, we know from your talk, and I think most people know this, maybe intellectually, that money and stuff doesn't bring you happiness. Or it doesn't for very long. It's fleeting happiness, or it's temporary, or it's some other type of non-permanence. And even children, I think you had a little slide as they're the world's worst roommate initially, right? Children are the world's worst roommate. So you took us through a bunch of those things, and then you basically took us through four I guess, overall themes: relationships, genes, adaptation, and effort, right? And then you gave us strategies on all of those, but I'm wondering if you could just give us an overview of why are those the four things that matter, and why do they matter, and how do they matter?
So, I think those all matter, although they matter in different ways. So if we think about sort of genes, so I'm going to just kind of start with the basic. The reality in terms of genes is that about half of our happiness is due to our genes. And again, that probably is the kittens and rainbows kind of a gene, optimism, et cetera, but also probably resilience that we just talked about. So genetics means some people get a head start. But again, that means 50% is up to us. So is
there a particular gene marker that you can look at that are serious?
No, and that's actually a really important question. Thank you for asking that. Because what it seems to be is that there are a bunch of different genes that all play a role. And some of those might be genes that, for example, allow us to easily have good relationships. Even the work on resilience, there's like a constellation of 6 different genes that seem to allow people to be resilient. So it's not the happy gene or the not happy gene. It seems to be a compilation, a variety of, and probably even more, than we know. So genes are a part of it. The process of adaptation is something that we often think of as hurting happiness, because it means when you get, more stuff or a raise or whatever, then you're going to be happy forever. And then it wears off. Again, as you said, it's fleeting, it's temporary, we adapt. But the key about adaptation is it also means horrible, tragic, awful things can happen and I can still be happy again. And that's really important, because adaptation doesn't just work in the good things happen and I adapt and then I'm not permanently happy. Adaptation means you can experience loss and grief and tragedy, and eventually, not immediately, but eventually also find happiness. So I look at those as sort of two sides of a coin in terms of happiness. Now,
and would that be like the sort of time heals all wounds type of thing?
Yeah, I think that would be. And it also means that over time, we adjust to the reality of, I wish, that my mom had not died. And I am sadder that I don't have her in my life, but I can still, do X, Y, and Z and be happy. It can mean, that people who've had cancer, who've been diagnosed with cancer, overwhelmingly will point to benefits that they have accrued, what we call in psychology, post-traumatic growth, that after some trauma, many people find a new sense of meaning or hope, or spiritual faith or other kinds of things. So all of those things may result and may help explain this adaptation.
Okay.
Now, the third thing that you referenced, which I think in some ways is the most important, and that is effort. That I think many people have a sense of happiness is something that happens to them. If I'm genetically lucky, if I win the lottery, if I get that prize job, or my kids turn out perfectly, or, I marry the perfect person, that, happiness is something that happens to me. And the reality is that just isn't true, right? That happiness is about effort. I have to decide to be happy, and I have to do things that will make me happy. And that effort really links back to something you and I have also talked about in this conversation, which is about control. I can't control lots of different things in the world, but what I can control are things in my life that make me happy. And I make a pretty diligent effort in my own life, again, because I'm not naturally happy, to sort of say, these are the things that I need to do to feel happy. And I do them. And I do them in a pretty sort of structured and organized way. And the things that make me happy may not make you happy, or your listeners happy, or your wife happy, or your child happy, or whatever. But finding the things that work for you is really important. And then finally, and I'm saying this one finally only because really what the research would tell us over and over again is that the quality of our relationships is the single best predictor of our happiness. And that can be relationships with romantic partners, with friends, with family members, with colleagues, with neighbors, et cetera. But the quality of our relationships is the single best predictor of our happiness. And in fact, the sort of flip side of that is that loneliness is as detrimental to happiness and health as smoking. So finding and pursuing good relationships, again, in your personal and professional life is just extraordinarily important. And that is actually something that we all do have some control over.
And speaking of relationships, do I remember you saying that men are much easier to make happy in a relationship than women, or something along those lines?
I mean, married men, I think what you're reflecting, married men are happier than single men. And it doesn't matter who they're married to.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, right.
Marriage for men is very good. And that's in part because even women who work outside the home, often carry the brunt of, childcare, family, dinners, cleaning, planning for holidays, social engagement. So, and it's one of the reasons why when men experience the loss of a spouse, they are much more likely to get remarried. They are much more likely to find, okay, I'm going to get remarried. Whereas women may get remarried, may not, but may also say, I'm going to spend more time with my sister or my friends, or, I'm going to travel with my kids, or, whatever. So that marriage tends to be consistently better for men than it is for women.
And interestingly, when men get remarried, they're just as happy as the first time they were married. Basically, I'm not making an overall point there, but just generally speaking, it's like, I have a relationship, so the
state of marriage is very good for men.
Okay. That's it. Full stop. Okay.
Hey everybody, just a quick pause here to let you know how much I appreciate you making time for my podcast. If you're not already a subscriber, please become one today and leave a review and tell a friend. And now let's get back to the show.
So do you have time for just one more thing that I want to explore?
Sure. Yeah.
So I want to explore this people standing by, this inaction thing that we mentioned in your bio. And I feel like maybe I don't know if it's the most famous case, but it's the one I remember. It's the story of Kitty Genovese, right? Or Genovese, or however you say her name. And the story was that, she was basically attacked on the street in New York City, or one of the cities, and nobody did anything about it. And I think, I listened to a podcast that went deep into that, and it turned out that people did a lot of things, but none of the things that were done actually ended up saving her life. And I don't remember all the details, but I'm really curious about this inaction thing, because I feel like when I see something happening that that doesn't look quite right, but also I'm not 100% sure is wrong. I think two things. One, is this any of my business? And two, if I act, what am I going to get? Am I going to get, killed? So there's like those two, because your normal human reaction, I think the way that we're wired, right? Maybe amygdala or whatever, we see something happening, we either want to run away from it or we want to run into it, depending on how threatened we feel, I suppose, or what the outs are. If you don't have an out, you're going to attack, right? So anyway, curious, what is this all about?
So in all honesty, this is like where, so although we've talked about the science of happiness, my newest book really is on this precise topic. And this book came from an incident that happened to my son in his first 2 weeks of college, about 5 years ago now. He started college, and 2 weeks into his first year, he called me one night and said, "Mom, a student died in my dorm last night." And then he told me the story. And the story was one that, even if you don't know this particular case, it's going to sound familiar because it happens all the time. Kid was drinking on a Saturday night. He fell and hit his head. His friends and roommates watched over him for hours. They strapped a backpack to his shoulders to stop him from rolling onto his back and vomiting and asphyxiating himself. They checked to make sure he was still breathing. So they did all these things because they cared about him and they wanted him to be okay. But what they didn't do for 19 hours was call 911. Mm-hmm. And when they finally did call, he was rushed by ambulance to a local hospital. The hospital kept him alive on life support until his family could fly in from out of state and be with him when they disconnected him. But the kid died, 19 years old, first 2 weeks of college. And when my son told me that story, I was just so struck by how that story could have gone differently. I was struck as a mom. I was struck as a college professor that sort of story plays out all the time. So that really that was the impetus for my book, Why We Act, that story, because I really wanted to understand the psychology of inaction in that case. So when we talk about the bystander effect, and yes, I talk about the Kitty Genovese book, story in my book, at length. I sort of unpack that story and how it was told and what happened, et cetera. But what we often think about as the bystander effect are these sort of dramatic examples, right? So the Kitty Genovese story, somebody, jumped out of the night and started stabbing her. Or, recently we think about, somebody with an assault rifle, and is there a hero who charges them, et cetera. But what I really unpack in my book are the much more sort of mundane examples that happen all the time. So, someone sitting in a boardroom and hearing something racist or sexist or homophobic, somebody sitting in a locker room and having somebody engage in discussion of sexual misconduct. We've all been in situations in which we hear or see something problematic and we're not really sure what to do. And so my book really kind of goes through, well, what is the psychology of that? And as you sort of alluded to in when you see something and you're not sure what to do, there actually are three factors that the psychology research points to that lead people to not step up. One, they don't really know what's happening. Is that student drunk or really unconscious and in trouble? Is that harmless flirting or is that sexual harassment? Is that racist and offensive, or is that kind of a harmless joke? So one thing that happens is we just don't know how to interpret it. It's ambiguous. Two, we know it's problematic, but we're in a group and we think, well, it's not my responsibility. Like any of these other people could step up. It doesn't have to be me. And this sort of sense of diffusion of responsibility, or what psychologists call social loafing. And then three, social loafing. Good, isn't it? People love that term.
Yeah.
It totally makes sense. Three, we worry about the consequences. If I speak up, am I going to be ostracized? Am I going to be rejected from my fraternity? Am I going to be the whistleblower who doesn't get the promotion? Am I going to be physically harmed? And so those three factors, not really sure what we're seeing, ambiguity, diffusion of responsibility, feeling like it's not our responsibility, and then fear of the consequences. Those are the three factors that overwhelmingly lead people not to step up. And the good news is that by understanding the sort of psychology of inaction, we can actually overcome those forces. So my book kind of delves into the psychology of inaction. Then it talks about specific examples bullying in school, sexual misconduct in colleges, unethical behavior in various different kinds of workplaces, from law firms to Congress, to police departments, to Harvey Weinstein's headquarters, to Enron and Theranos, et cetera. And then the last two, what I call the uplifting chapters, talk about what can we tell from the people who do step up, the so-called moral rebels who always speak up, the whistleblowers, and how can we all sort of train ourselves to be people who speak up and step up and do the right thing even when it's hard. So that, in fact, is my sort of newest passion, and I'm hoping this book makes a difference.
How do you practice it? Like how?
Yeah. So one, I think that I am very mindful of putting myself in somebody else's shoes. So I spend a lot of time sort of talking about empathy. Shortly after the pandemic hit, one of my friends called me to tell me a story about her daughter, Claire, who had been, Claire was adopted from China when she was a baby. Claire is like 22, 23 years old. She's on a crowded bus in Boston shortly after the pandemic hits. When a man on the bus stands up, points at her and says, "You should go back to China. You and your fellow Chinese people are killing Americans." The bus is crowded and nobody does anything. Nobody calls out the man, but nobody even goes over and sits with Claire and distracts her or supports her. She just sits on the bus alone, scared. And so what I think to myself is, if it was my daughter sitting on that bus, I'd want somebody to go sit with her. If it was my son in a college dorm room unconscious, I would want somebody to immediately call 911. And so I spend a lot of time sort of thinking about empathy. And I also talk a lot about how in most situations, there are lots of other people who are also thinking, "Ooh, that's problematic," but don't want to get involved. And so I find myself often being the person at a meeting saying like, "Hey, I think we might be kind of misinterpreting this," or "Hey, maybe you didn't mean it, but," and overwhelmingly when that happens, people will email me later or come up to me privately and be like, "I'm so glad you said that. I was thinking that." And so I think, again, understanding the psychology of inaction can help all of us step up and make the world a better place.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's and that's in your book, Why We Act, in the US, right? Why We Act, Turning Bystanders into Moral Rebels.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really complicated topic, I think. Really complicated topic because a lot of it, because you don't know what people is going on in their head, the people that are saying these things to Claire. You don't know, you don't know if you get in the middle of that, whether there's, going to be a weapon, or whether there's, you just don't know. And that's scary for people.
And I think that's also why, one of the keys, and I talk about this at length, is being a moral rebel doesn't have to mean standing up and telling that guy, "Shut up, sit down, you're stupid, you're racist." Being a moral rebel can be, I'm going to go over and sit with Claire and be like, "Hey, what are we doing this weekend? Have you seen this movie? Oh, I really like your skirt." I mean, being a moral rebel doesn't have to be standing up and saying, charging the person. Being a moral rebel can be sitting with somebody, can be giving them support, can be offering them, comfort or support in private, but it can be basically letting the person who's being victimized in some way know that they're not alone.
Yeah.
We also see time and time again. And what's been striking to me in talking about this topic, again, which I've done for, law firms and teachers and high schools and, corporate boards, et cetera, is that overwhelmingly everybody will say to me, "Let me tell you a story." And then they'll tell me a story, and it'll be a story sometimes of, 30 years ago, I was on a bus and I saw this thing and I didn't step up and I've always felt terrible. Or, I remember, being in a locker room and this person said something and I should have spoken up. Or I remember being in an airport. And so many, many people have stories of times that they didn't step up and they wish they had, or that their kid was being bullied or attacked and no one stood up. So it's something that I think many of us can relate to, and understanding, well, what inhibits us from speaking up is in fact very powerful.
And that was a really great tactic or strategy that you shared there. It was like, so instead of you feeling like you need to, get into the aggressor's face, just empathize with the aggressee.
Yeah. Exactly. So it doesn't have to be being the big hero. It can just be going and sitting with somebody. It can be for a high school student, if there's a kid being bullied, go sit with that kid at lunch. I mean, again, it can be lots of different things that are just about, let me support the person. And again, there are lots of different tools and strategies that we can all use that really can make a difference.
Well, Dr. Sanderson, thank you so much for joining me today. As I mentioned at the beginning, sandersonspeaking.com is where you can find out about Katherine with a C. You can also check out her TED Talk and, of course, her books, which I assume are available everywhere books are sold. But I don't know if there's a particular place you want to drive people or you want people to connect with you in a certain way.
Well, thanks for asking. So yes, my books are available everywhere, including Amazon. But what I like to call it in particular is independent bookstores have been really hurt during the pandemic. So I'm always encouraged if people will support their local independent bookstore. And for people who are fans of Audible, I actually read my books aloud. So if you'd like to hear me read and you're on Audible and you enjoy, listening to books while you run on a treadmill or drive in the car or whatever, you can hear me read my books aloud as well.
Awesome. I'm going to download your latest book right now on Audible, and I'm going to listen to it because I do want to hear your voice. Tell me about it.
Well, in fact, many people have said that it's like, when the author reads the book, there's like kind of a special meaning of that. So not a professional book reader, but they are my words. So there we go.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure getting to know you, and I appreciate you sharing with us and letting me explore your story.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to talk, and I will look forward to connecting at Dickinson family reunions.
There you go.
So there we go.
Sounds good.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.